Great. And I think we're recording and broadcasting. Wonderful. All right. So we're here for our Theme 3 commentary session. We have three wonderful commentators, Antonis Anastasopoulos, Ishita Das Gupta, and Laura Williams. So we're going to have them do some initial remarks, each of them individually, and we'll start with Antonis.
All right. Thank you, Roger. Thank you all for being here, for having me. So I want to preface these remarks by saying that I'm just a computer scientist. That means not a cognitive scientist or a linguist, even though I really wish I were one. But I've worked with linguists for most of my career. And there have been so many interesting things said that I haven't managed to put my thoughts together in a coherent thing. So I think what I'm going to do is just throw out stuff and draw lines and hope that I end up with a mural painting. So this is okay. Yeah, it's like 5 slides. So what I wanted to say is that a lot of my work that I've done in mostly language model, in natural language processing, really in computer science, is basically trying to model everything and everyone. And that means modeling also underserved communities, modeling language varieties, modeling non-native speakers, and modeling languages that have 10 or 20 speakers left, which don't really have any commercial value for any big tech to model, but it's also just very, very important. Basically, we heard initially from Roger that there's 6,700 approximately languages in the world, and we're not even there yet, right? So, and we talked a lot through these 2 days about humans and language with a capital L, but we didn't talk about which humans and which languages we're doing all of this work on. So again, I'm not a cognitive scientist, but people who are published this paper that said that only looking at English speakers can be very, very problematic potentially for all of the conclusions that we draw from our science. And why? Because we're looking at very, very specific things. There's 6,700 systems of expressing thought, right? They have their unique characteristics, and we're only looking at one or a few of them, right? And then I wanted to share this. Also goes back to the work that we do in LLMs. Like, we have to rely on the data that we have. And when you look at the data that we have, they come from very specific regions of the world in very specific languages. And we did this project a couple of years ago at this point where we tried to look through common data sets and see where basically do they come from, trying to make very rough approximations. And in most of the data sets that we looked at, you end up with maps like this. There's a dataset geography link on our website that you can explore all the maps, but basically they're all weird standing for Western educated, industrialized nations. And then again, I want to reiterate, if you think about from the linguistics perspective, right, we have described about 2,000 or a little bit more of all of these systems that we have to express thought, and we're not even close to being done, right? And at the same time, that's a race against time, because a lot of those systems will stop being in use in the coming century. So one thing that I think, bringing us to the main question of the topic is, in the previous slide, is LLMs, and I heard Gasper saying that LLMs can be good linguists, right? We can have these AI assistants that can help us analyze data much, much faster to uncover interesting things in those systems. But as Adele kind of said, I don't think that just getting more data in GPT will just get it done, right? The devil and all of the interesting stuff that linguists care about are all in the details and in the way that people use these systems in specific situations for specific functions. And the current approach to multilingual models, like modeling a lot of the world's languages, is just dumb. It's like very annoying. You put together all of the data that you have in all of the languages and then hope that something happens. And it does, right? You get really good systems, better than if you only trained systems for just one language. But then they do really weird things, like you have factual memorization in one language, but then not in others. This graph is from a trying to retrieve factual factual facts, basically, from, it's a little dated, it's on smaller models, but then the accuracy is just not the same across languages, right? But you ask any human that is bilingual or multilingual, you tell them a fact in one language, they can retrieve it in another. So there's weird things happening here. The same thing on when we look at the biases that might be modeled within these multilingual models. But it doesn't matter what these are. I don't want to take too much time, but basically, they don't behave the same thing when you ask the same question in different languages. And again, that's very weird. So I also wanted to basically say that the future of us as humans is multilingual. The present is multilingual. The majority of the world is multilingual. And this is a picture of my son who's like growing up to be trilingual. And I looked through, again, I'm not a cognitive scientist or a language acquisition person. I looked through the Google Scholar accounts for work on multilingual kids versus not mentioning the default, just language acquisition, right? L1 versus bilingual or multilingual or trilingual or multilingual kids. And they're just, next slide, they're just a fraction of the overall work. And I could have substituted the photo of my son with a map of India, where multilingualism is the de facto expectation in most communities. I wanted to share two things that I'm kind of excited about to answer some of the questions in the theme. So the first one is that, like, the language descriptions that linguists produce use language, right? So there's this meta-linguistic thing that is happening. And if we think of how humans, maybe not as an L1 acquisition, but as an L2 acquisition type phase learn, then we can also think of this as like a very interesting generalization aspect of as the ability to learn, where someone describes to you how a language works, and you're now able to produce output in that language. There was this very cool paper that does that, and that also ties to what Gaspard talked about LLMs being good linguists, I guess. Again, I don't want to substitute linguists, they're amazing. But there's a lot of opportunity, I think, there, especially also from on the direction of how can we model those languages that we don't have enough data to do anything on them right now. And then the other thing is, like, if we have really good models that can act as proxies for the human brain, this is very exciting, because all of these studies on language acquisition and fMRI machines and all of that, right? It means that they're all super expensive. Not to mention that it's not easy to find a Greek, Spanish, English native speaker and do experiments on them. So if we have proxies that we can train on, and they act as humans, so they behave in similar ways as humans. There's this very nice paper, again, not that people at Stanford need propping up their work, but there's this very nice paper, again, by Dan Yuravsky's group, that basically showed that if you train a bilingual model, it ends up acting in a way that, the two languages influence each other in predictable ways, and it kind of mimics what bilingual speakers do in a way. So that's particularly exciting, because then we can study those systems and the way that they interact, and maybe the way that they change as we go into the future. I think that's all I have.
Great, thanks so much. And we'll
Yeah.
continue with Ishita. See how I get to her slide. Okay. And I will, where are the good, so this, no. Hold on a second. This is it? No.
I think I've slightly overused animations. I might
Does
need you
it
to
start
press it
with a
2
striking
times.
similarity?
Sorry?
Okay, great. It starts with a striking similarity?
Yes,
Great.
indeed.
Hold on a second.
I'll start with at least introducing myself. I'm Ishita. I'm again I'm not a linguist by training. I used to work primarily in cognitive science. I used to care about things like judgment, decision making, probabilistic reasoning, causal reasoning, these kinds of things. The last couple of years I've been at DeepMind, so I've also sort of gotten, so this background in cognitive science has me interested in thinking about how language models can give us this insight into humans as well as that connection. But the last few years working in corporations, like working at Google, I've also kind of gotten interested in thinking about how these can maybe augment the things that we're good at or bad at, and kind of what is a good collaborative system in some sense. Like, is it interesting to also think about the things that we actually can't do so well, and maybe we want these systems to do instead. So what I'll actually talk about today is more on the former, just things about what are places where I think we can get some interesting insight into humans, or understand how humans represent the world by looking at these artificial systems. And I'll start with a couple of things, both on the theme of like groundedness, how important the importance of real world information is, in addition to sort of formal understanding of language. So I'll first start with sort of a similarity that we found between language models and humans that I think is kind of interesting. So if you press next, so this exact example came up in Adele's talk of like, if X is more than Y, then Y is less than X. And, that's sort of like this ability to compute this logical relationship for all X and Y is implicit in some understanding of logical reasoning. But of course, this is really not at all how humans operate. It isn't humans find logical. So again, I didn't mention, but as a result of not growing up as a linguist, I usually use language as a proxy for other cognitive tasks. So this is a logical reasoning task that I was interested in. So then what we found was, next slide, was basically that humans and language models actually show a lot of similar content effects on what these X and Y need to be for people to actually successfully do reasoning, like abstract reasoning over these entities. So some of these effects are similar in spirit to some of the stuff that I think Tom spoke about yesterday, where like, things that have common, more like higher priors are more likely to be obvious continuation. So for example, something like, if puddles are smaller than oceans, then oceans are larger than puddles is easy to complete, because oceans are larger than puddles are also just more likely, it has a higher prior probability. So similarly, like if puddles are larger than oceans and oceans are smaller, therefore oceans are smaller than puddles is obviously a harder continuation because it has lower prior probability. So that's kind of one family of things that we looked at, but there was also this other family of things where the actual output probabilities were the same. So for example, in these syllogisms and Wason card selection tasks, and if people are familiar with them, I'm happy to talk about them in more detail, but the output of whether or not this is a logical answer or not, the prior probabilities of those were not manipulated. It was just what was in the context, whether the logical operations were occurring over familiar or not familiar concepts, abstract or familiar concepts. And we found very strikingly similar behavior in both language models and humans in these effects. So now I think there's an interesting question there of what the origin of that is. Like, of course, it's possible that because these models are trained on internet text, these biases are present in internet text, so the model just learned them. But there's also potentially some other interesting questions about, like, are these biases a property of the data in general? Do they come up without you having to, like, when you have content and form mixing, that these biases will show up irrespective? And I think this kind of gives us an interesting, just the next slide, it gives us an interesting insight, I think, where these kinds of content effects have showed up in human cognitive science in like a very large range of domains. They show up in logical reasoning, they show up in probabilistic reasoning, they show up in language, they show up in very different places. And we don't really, like, and there's a lot of work going into trying to understand the mechanisms for these content effects, like all these dual system approaches. And like, there's a lot of work going into understanding what are the possible ways in which these two kinds of behaviors can emerge. And I think the fact that they show up in language models and they show up in the simplest of stimuli, I think is kind of an interesting place to draw inspiration for other kinds of mechanisms that might explain these behaviors in humans. And I'm not just like, you might say that, okay, now we have two different black boxes that show the same behavior. Are we any further ahead than we were before? I think in some senses, yes, because we saw yesterday as well that some of the interpretability methods for these models, you just have much more ability to sort of dig into the details of these models. And I actually think I'm new to the mechanistic interpretability land, but I'm actually quite excited about it because these transformers, they're so relatively sparse. These attention matrices are relatively sparse, so they're kind of easy to human interpret circuits out of. So I think that's kind of an interesting direction to think about, like if there are mechanisms that we can derive for these kinds of content effects within these artificial systems, can they give us at least hypotheses about how they might emerge in humans? So that's one thing. And so the next slide. So the other thing I'll talk about also kind of related to this notion of how grounded information interacts with formal competence in humans, but I'll talk actually specifically about the role of vision. So so if you just press it 2 times. Yeah, so basically the one striking difference I think it's come up in talks earlier today as well, that like the importance of grounded knowledge, everyday information, everyday knowledge in our how we speak, how we represent the world. And nowadays we have all of these large models starting to incorporate vision into their inputs. But I want to say that this is I think the way that they're doing it, it's an open question. There are many, it's not really clear what the best way to integrate vision into these language models are. It's an open area of research. But I think one thing is going to be true, that for humans, or anything that developed in animals, everything that developed in the natural world, vision, I think, happened a little before language. Like there's a lot more, like the visual cortex is more is developed in earlier systems. It's been around for longer. Children, like they interact with visual stimuli and much earlier than they can produce or understand language. And whereas in models, I think you have this very striking difference. Language data, just by the way, the technology that we have access to, language information is a lot easier for models to access than any embodied visual data. So you have so more likely than not, while of course it's an evolving area, more likely than not, in humans, you have this situation where language sort of gloms onto representations learned visually, whereas very likely in models, you're going to have visual representations that glom onto representations learned linguistically. So I think that creates a sort of interesting distinction where, so for example, one of the things, like I think Anya brought this up about how spatial reasoning is very poor in language, not surprisingly, because predominantly we do this with visual embodied modalities. We don't usually use language for spatial reasoning. And similarly, there are things that we use vision for, like even for things that aren't necessarily fundamentally visual. There are things that for a math problem, I might draw a diagram to understand to better understand this problem. There might be domains in which, like, even when I'm trying to understand or remember something, very likely I use visual memory. So there are things where, because of this primacy of visual information, that we use visual data as well in a way that potentially language models will not learn how to do, because they have so much more language data. So I think this kind of raises a few interesting questions. And next slide, just as a pointer, like we had this work from earlier where we were looking at just as a highlight of how different visual processing in these models might be. In the first image, you have this, like the ways in which suppose you provide an image to a model. Most of the time when you and I are interacting with visual stimuli, I can sort of point to things, right? I can tell you, pay attention to this part of the image, pay attention to that part of the image. And I can use a laser pointer. That's something that is relatively hard to do with a model, because you usually just give them an image. So communicating about an image can be a little bit difficult. So we were trying to bridge that gap by just saying, let's just, overlay numbered circles on the image and ask the model to refer to parts of the image by referring to those numbers. And so it does this surprisingly well. It can kind of say, okay, which of these numbers overlaps most with the red shirt in front, and it can kind of tell you which number that is. The thing that was kind of strikingly, so this kind of looks a little bit like, reference and pointing, the things that, we use when we're interacting with visual stimuli. One thing that was very striking for me was that, at least in anecdotal evidence, we found that for a model, if I just provide those two images separately, like on the right, it does almost as well. So it's very, like, the fact that these are, like, the ways in which these are tokenized into these linear strings, because that's what the model is used to processing, has these sort of weird effects which you don't really expect. And I think they show up a lot when you're looking at other modalities, especially. And next slide. And so these are findings these are from last year. Models have obviously gotten better, but there's reason, like we invest so much energy in data visualization, again, because we consume things visually so much more. But for a model, drawing conclusions from a visual scatter plot is sometimes harder than drawing conclusions from just the raw data. Again, and so I think these have kind of interesting questions on the next slide for also just kind of understanding in humans. I think this brings up a point of things we just took for granted. There are some things we do visually, some things we do with language, but haven't actually thought about why we do it in each of these modalities. I think this raises some interesting questions in humans about what makes something easier to do with visual stimuli rather than with language stimuli. And also questions for like human-computer interaction, like if we want models to be producing explanations that we will understand, do we need them to be communicating in a way that we will better understand, especially when intermodality information is concerned? And I think, so I think those are also sort of areas that so I think both of these are different ways in which grounded information enters our representations. And I think the differences are a sort of interesting source for investigation.
All right, thank you. And then finally, we're going to turn it over to Laura Williams, who doesn't have any slides. So I'm going to blank out the screen here. Go ahead.
Nice. Yeah, sorry, I'm going old school. Hi, everyone. Hi, world. So my name's Laura Williams. I'm an assistant professor at Stanford University. And the purpose of this session was to talk about the future of the interface between human language, I'm adding in human brain, and LLMs. So we have these three components. So I thought maybe it would be helpful to first kind of summarize the links that I've seen come up between those three in the session we just had, but I feel like some of these points have come out yesterday too. And then also highlight some of what I think some of the promising future directions are, either from what other people have said and sprinkling in some of my own opinions too. Okay, so we have large language models, we have the human brain, and we have linguistics/cognitive science. And I think that these three aspects have informed one another in a few different ways. So let's take large language models. These have clearly been used to great success to help us understand the neuroscience of language. And we're able to explain way more variance in neural responses than I think we've been able to do with handmade annotations. And they also allow us to analyze neural responses when people are doing things they like to do, like listening to audiobooks, versus being bombarded with isolated words and non-words. And I think that is a really important way forward that we've already made a lot of progress on, is to be able to understand language processing as people process language in a way that they do in real life. I also see large language models as a really promising hypothesis generator for the types of ways that the human brain processes language. And I think there's been some progress in that, but in order for it to be a hypothesis generator, we need to have a hypothesis of what it's actually doing and what it's representing. And I think we'll get to that in the future directions. I think that that is something that requires interpretability, and that I think is something that we're still working on improving. Okay, so that's how large language models kind of help neuroscience. And we've heard a number of suggestions of how neuroscience can help large language models. So I've heard from Anna, for example, if we can make a model more brain-like, maybe it will be more human-like. And I'll talk about some thoughts there. And obviously, historically, as has also been brought up, neuroscience has been a big factor of how we've designed these models. So like convolutional neural networks were created because we understood something about how the visual system works. But maybe this link has become more and more tentative as time has gone by, that it seems that neuroscience has been, I don't know, less helpful than just kind of discovering by trial and error different architectures that seem to work. Okay, and then we have linguistics / computer science, and I think that so I heard I really liked Adina Williams' talk, talking about the different ways that we can kind of use linguistics to probe and evaluate the performance of models. And I feel like linguistics and cognitive science really still has a strong hold of importance in that space. But I didn't hear much about how we're really using linguistics to build these models either. And actually Adele brought up some nice points of maybe that's like not the right thing to prioritize. Okay, so I hope that was coherent, some different ways that these different fields are kind of interacting. And I'll just briefly touch on some of the future directions that I've kind of recognized to be important. So one, as I said, large language models hold a lot of promise for being hypothesis generators for neuroscience. And I've heard kind of two arguments for how we can improve that. One is actually make the model simpler so that we can understand them better. So make them more linear, or just make them have a fewer number of parameters so that we're more able to understand them. I get the point, but that seems a shame to me, honestly, because these models are so powerful. I would like to use the most powerful version of the model to be able to inform the neuroscience, but I do understand the point. Yeah, but I think that we've heard a lot, and I think that there's promise in general of explainable AI. So taking a very complicated model, but being able to get some interpretation from it. And so I feel like that is a really promising future direction, to be able to still use the powerful models, but pull out some explainable things from them. Yeah, and when I say things, I guess this is going to link actually to what I'm about to say. So I'll go back to it in a second. So and when we say maybe we should make these large language models more brain-like, the next question is, but in what way? So Anya gave some examples of maybe architecturally we can create some similarities. So maybe we can make GPT have a language network, and maybe that will help. I think that, so that's kind of like the implementational level. I think I would argue that maybe we should focus on the more like representational level, that maybe we know that there is some representations of language that are useful in the human brain and have also been identified in linguistics. Maybe we can, like make it more human-like representationally and computationally rather than implementationally. And I think maybe all of this has also come up. Maybe all of this is going to be more important when we're actually trying to build models that are more data efficient and are more energy efficient. That maybe that's when the rubber's going to hit the road, of when we actually will need to put these priors in. Okay, so I think I talked enough. Very happy to discuss more. Thank you.
Great, thanks all three of you. So I want to pose a brief question that hopefully builds on all of the talks and also on the remarks that you made. So, I think to those of us who worked in NLP for many years, and to those of us in the audience that are coming from other fields, I think that that the last 4 or 5 years have really been quite a startling set of developments in terms of the capabilities of large language models. When ChatGPT first came out, that captivated public imagination, and and thought about the nature of language and have we reached artificial intelligence in a way that I think was really, it's quite startling. And one thing that's striking about that is that initial breakthrough was, and the breakthroughs that preceded it, are entirely about language in a purely textual modality, right? So you have a disembodied agent that not only does it not have a body, not only does it act in the world, but it doesn't even have sensory experience. All it has is textual experience, yet people have these prolonged, detailed interactions with them. They're very compelling, and it has raised interesting philosophical questions about, for example, whether an agent in a text-only modality can mean in a meaningful sense of mean, for example. But I'm not sure how long that debate is going to continue because very rapidly we're starting to see large language models interface with other kinds of data, most notably static images, but increasingly, I'm sure we're going to see it more with video and with other kinds of non-linguistic sound. And I think in the themes talks, we also saw the relationship between language and meaning in a bunch of different ways. So for example, one of the things I really loved about Adele's talk was her examples using subject-verb agreement, where it's clear that you can't understand, why the hash browns, when you say the hash browns is waiting, how that can even be both a meaningful and a grammatical sentence, despite the subject-verb disagreement, unless you think about the fact that, well, this is a reference to something in the world. And it's that mode of referring using language that enables that kind of relationship. In Anya's talk, of course, Anya spelled out an elaborated theory on the architecture of language and its relations to other cognitive functions. With Gasper, we extended not only beyond text, but we looked at speech and even communicative systems in other species. And in Alex's work, we saw this remarkable bridging between language and vision through the brain, not directly to each other, which is really quite striking. And I want to ask what this all means to you all in terms of how you think about language. This workshop has been framed as a workshop on the scientific study of language and its relation to LLMs. Is the scientific study of language a thing in its own right anymore? Or does it have to be intrinsically connected with other aspects of cognition and neuroscience and the world? Anybody can take a stab at that.
I mean, again, I'm not a linguist, but I don't think it was ever, no, let me rephrase that. There were times and a lot of work done just looking at language itself outside of all of the other modalities. And that has its value, right? Understanding the system. But if you care about humans, there's no way to disentangle all of these other elements from it. And maybe a lot of the problems that the text-only or language-only formalisms or descriptions that we have are exactly because of ignoring all of these other aspects. So this is exciting that we're able to put them somehow into all one model, right? Even though we can actually not yet look into the model.
Yeah, just adding on to that as well, I think, and also to keep in given that these models were trained, and I think a large part of the success of these models is because language is such a good representation of all the information that humans have, and we've put all of this information on the internet, and now you can train on it. So I feel like given that all of these models were trained so explicitly on humans, producing language in semi-natural domains where they're actually talking about things and they have purposes, I think it feels like it's kind of, again, like it becomes, given that the way these models were trained, it becomes a little bit difficult to disentangle all of the other reasons that people produce language from the models themselves because they were trained on that data. But I think that difference also is, I still think there's a difference. I think that's come up a few times, like the importance of things like reinforcement learning from human feedback. And I think reinforcement came up yesterday as well as a sort of thing that's missing. So I think there's still, it's not, I'm not saying that these models are trained on like very human-like stimuli by any means. But yeah, given that the content engages so much with all of the other things that humans are trying to do, it's trained on textbooks, it's trained on everything that people do with language, and people do a lot of things with language, so I think it becomes hard to disentangle.
Yeah, I also feel like large language models have the most use when you're trying to understand something that is symbolic and abstract, and less use when you're actually trying to understand the sensory modality, because we have better ways of actually summarizing sensory modalities numerically, that we don't need to rely on a complex system like an LLM. And so from that perspective, like if you're trying to understand how the brain processes meaning, then even better if it has multiple modalities of what meaning means. So I think it's only a strength from that perspective.
These are great answers to the question. Thank you. So let me go and build on something that a couple of you brought up and also came up elsewhere in the talks. Is there something fundamentally that we're doing wrong, given the fact that we need not only once we do the initial pre-training of large language models on text, then we need to do reinforcement learning with human feedback, or preference optimization. And I ask that trying to connect to Gasper's work about really Gasper was sort of laying out one of the sort of secondary themes, or maybe he thought of it as a primary theme in his research and talk, was about sort of modeling the developmental trajectory of language in the earliest stages of acquisition. And it's almost a truism in language development research that kids don't need feedback. So I have, as an anecdote, so I have a 2.5-year-old son, and he's just sort of starting the multi-word stage of language production, and he has his own words. This is not an uncommon phenomenon. So for example, da means, it can mean car, bus, bike, all sorts of different things. And so if I gesture at my, if I gesture at my bike, he says da 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 for bike, and I say, yeah, it's dada's bike, and he says da da da. That's his response. So he's not learning from feedback. So what is it about the models? Is it about is it our data sets are wrong? Is it that our models are trained inefficiently? Or is it that should we actually be rethinking about the kind of experience that young children have in terms of how they're learning language? Is it possible that they're getting more tacit, indirect kind of feedback, and that's actually guiding their language acquisition in a way that is not the conventional way of thinking about how human language acquisition works? What should we make of this disconnect?
So one thought I have there is these models are so different in so many other ways. It's not like you've isolated this one factor that is different, that they need have this reinforcement and your son doesn't. They also just their architecture is totally different. The data they're exposed to is totally different. The training objective is totally different. So given all of those other vast differences, it's not surprising to me that the way that they learn also is different.
Yeah, and I also think while we think of in our everyday life, I feel like you think of feedback as a sort of very explicit thing, whereas there are things that probably people pick up on which are very implicit because we're sort of hardwired to reinforcement learn in some sense. Like they're just a turn of just the way that somebody's gestures look, or the way that emotion and things like that. I feel like people probably pick up, even if it's not explicitly correcting the linguistic utterance. There's probably some other kinds of information that are easy to learn from, even if it's not necessarily explicit feedback. So I think that's one thing I wanted to mention, of given the way that these models are designed, language is the only way that you can say anything or do anything to them, but that's not really how people take feedback from other modalities on how to improve their language, whereas that's not something that these models can do. And I think the other thing I wanted to mention is that in all of the analogies that I do feel like for the language models, there are these two fairly distinct phases, where you have this pre-training phase where almost it's sort of just learning sequence structure of how sequences work, and I don't think that that's actually the right learning. A child is not really the right analogy for that. I would say that something what maybe some slightly more evolutionary time scale is a better analogy for that. What gave rise to the fact that we even have a language brain area. Currently a transformer doesn't have any of those inductive biases, isn't primed to pick up on a lot of these structures. So I think maybe the post-training phase is a little bit more of an analogy to how, where we're actually learning with feedback from other parents or humans or anything else, what exactly I should do with the structure that I've learned.
Great. Yeah. And then I have one last question for before we move on to the panel discussion, which is, so another cross-cutting theme that we saw emerge in a number of talks, both in this session and in commentaries in this session and before, was sort of the way of thinking about like the nature of the training data and sort of a Bayesian way of thinking about what language model behavior is like. So in Tom's talk yesterday, thinking about the kinds of where you can predict task performance based on the prior basically whether you have a really the response has high prior probability. So we saw that's one manifestation of that, where the models are better at counting the number of words in the sentence when the number is 50 than when it's 49 or 51. We also saw the content effects, Ishita, that you described are also, a lot of those are things that we can think about as sort of being, people are biased toward, endorsing conclusions that they think are already true, regardless of whether the premises actually support them. And maybe even thinking about like the sort of the multilinguality, the sort of the accent in BERT and so forth, that those are coming from just that the English data is sort of so much larger in the training corpus of a multilingual data set that then all the other languages get influenced. And should we think of that as a feature or a bug? And if it's a bug, how do we fix it?
Can it be both? Because our models are like extremely inefficient, I feel. Even though they're extremely efficient at the same time, and when with really good models, they're also extremely inefficient at learning from the data, right? And they will take every shortcut they can take to learn from. Even when you throw a ton of data, they will still take all of the shortcuts. I don't know. I think evolutionarily, that's also like something that humans do, right? And that's a feature. But if you want to end up with sound, logical reasoning, which is also something that's learned for humans, then it's a step further, right? But yeah, the question of data is really big, and we're not making good use of even the tons of data that we have. So.
Just to, I think it's I think echoing something that you said as well, of like, given that these kinds of shortcuts are definitely things that humans learn as well. And I do think it's kind of an interesting way to better understand how these shortcuts emerge, because I think humans do them as well. So maybe trying to in a feature insofar as it might help us understand something else that we're interested in understanding. I also think that and in terms of the question about how to fix them, I think that I intended to mention this, but I didn't. But I think the different kinds of learning in these systems, I think, are quite different. And I think it's kind of not fully explored exactly how far we can get with the system, with small tweaks to the current system. So what I mean by that is there's reason to believe that while in-weights pre-trained information has a lot of these biases, some of them can be improved by in context learning. So what I mean by that is this reversal curse that's come up a few times, that if you, for example, if I ask a model to give me the first 5 presidents of the US in alphabetical order by their last name. This is very hard because it's probably not seen them in that order before. It's seen them in the order in which they were president, because that's the order in which it appeared on the internet. But if you ask it to say, okay, just produce them in the order you saw them and then alphabetize it, that's a lot easier for it to do. It regurgitates that information into its context, but once it's in its context, it can do much more symbolic manipulations on that information. So I feel like there are and all of these, the emergence of these induction heads and things like that do indicate that there is some sort of semi-symbolic kind of more abstract processing that's possible once the information has been dumped into context. So I feel like I don't think we fully explored how much we can address some of these sort of strange mistakes that we see when when in these in-weights kind of information, where you're just asking it to directly produce the data immediately. So I think that's another space for investigation, how much can we do with with these in-context type of methods.
I was just going to say, I don't know, it's not surprising that the models reflect the statistics of the input, and it's not surprising that it converges on most probable outputs, given that that's what it's trying to optimize for. But yeah, I feel like it's a feature of its training and what it's trying to optimize, but maybe there are ways to stop it from doing that.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks all three of you for a great commentary session. And now let's bring up the speakers for the panel discussion.